So this is the session that we've titled Worse Off Without Verse. That's very poetic. Is there a cause for concern for the future of poetry? That sounds so loaded. I'm hoping you'll take that up. Are publishers indeed reluctant to publish poetry and readers reluctant to buy it? Join the panel as they attempt to understand if poetry has indeed become the unprofitable segment within the publishing industry today. And if poetry should be accessible or literary or both. Are they mutually exclusive? The panel will also discuss the state of poetry in the Indian languages, if low sales and low readership are a product of each other, and the need, if there is one, to give poetry a boost. This panel is being chaired by Swati Daftor. Swati writes features for the Hindu's Sunday magazine, Literary Review and Metro Plus supplements. She has covered literature extensively, interviewing authors, reviewing books, and examining trends within different genres. Part of the core committee of the Hindu's Literature Festival Lit for Life, Swati has also been closely involved in the organization and execution of the festival. Recently, she has also revisited an old hobby, illustrating stories and articles for independent journals. Currently, she is curating an anthology for young adults. I request Swati and the panelists to please take a seat on stage. The panel members are Arundhati Subramaniam, Mr. Gopal Krishna Kotur, Hemant Devate, Kartika VK. Please come on stage. I realize I call some people Mr. and omitted for others, but that's just... I know, but it's just, I don't know, comes up on its own.
Works. Hello everyone, and so I have already been introduced, and so before we start I'll just introduce my panelists. Most of you will already know who they are, but just for form's sake, let's so we've got Arundhati Subramaniam. Arundhati Subramaniam is a poet and seeker, though not always in that order. She has worked over the years as arts journalist, curator and poetry editor. As poet, she has published 4 books of poetry. Most recently, When God is a Traveler, published by HarperCollins. And her prose work includes the best-selling biography of a contemporary mystic, Sadhguru, More Than a Life. As editor, her books include Another Country, Pilgrim's India, and Confronting Love, an anthology of love poems co-edited with Jerry Pinto. She divides her time between Bombay, Mumbai, and a yoga center in Coimbatore. Then we've got Mr. Gopi Krishnan Kotur. Mr. Kotur is an award-winning poet. His poetry has appeared in major poetry magazines in India and abroad. He has been represented in international poetry anthologies on contemporary Indian poetry in English. Could you tell me if I'm going too fast? I have this habit of speaking on the double. He attended the MFA poetry program of Texas State University in USA and was resident poet in Augsburg University in Germany, where his poems were translated and published in German. For a period from 1987 to 1994, he published the booklet magazine Every Man and Woman's Guide, headquartered in Chennai. He then founded Poetry Chain, a poetry quarterly that attained national recognition and published many of the major established and upcoming Indian poets in English. The journal ran uninterruptedly for 10 years. And then we've got Mr. Devate, Mr. Hemant Devate. He is a Marathi poet, literary editor, and publisher and translator. His 2 poetry collections in Marathi include Chautashi, Paryancha Kavita, and Thamtaj et Nahi. His poems have been translated into English, Spanish, Italian, Irish, French, German, Urdu, Gujarati, Bengali, Hindi, Odia, Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, and Malayalam. The translation of his most recent book in Marathi, Ya Rumate Ale Ki Life Shuru Hote. Perfect. Thank you. Was published by Poetry Wala, which is his own publishing house that publishes major poetry. And Hemant's publishing house, Paperwall Media and Publishing Private Limited, has published more than 50 collections of poetry in Marathi and English. He is also the founder and editor of the highly respected Marathi little magazine Abhida, which is now known as Abhidanantar.
Abhida?
Now it
was relaunched as
Abhidanantar. Okay, okay. Which saw uninterrupted publication for nearly 15 years before it was relaunched. So it's been relaunched again.
Relaunched again.
Okay.
We are again relaunching it this.
Okay. Okay. Great. And you've already met Kartika, but should I reintroduce in case someone was missing from the panels yesterday? Let's do it. Well, yes. She's the publisher of HarperCollins, and over the conversation, I'm sure we'll know more about poetry and Kartika. So, so actually, how I was thinking we'll do this is by first letting the panelists actually have a little bit of time to talk about poetry from their perspectives. We've got a number of perspectives here. So we've got someone who's publishing poetry from a mainstream publishing house, a big publishing house, and then we've got someone like Mr. Devante, who is also publishing poetry, and then we've got journals, and we've got people who are writing poetry. So let's, if anyone would like to start, would you like to start with, would Ms. Arundhati like to start?
What is the question?
Let's start with your opening comments. A leading question, yes. So a leading question, actually, let's look at the actual description of verse of without verse. And if you could just talk about if this is something that is a recent phenomenon that we are talking about, or is it something that we're only discussing now but has always been there? Has poetry ever been a profitable segment of the publishing industry, or if it's always been a sort of niche thing and we're only now examining something like this?
Yeah. Of course, about the profit part of it, I won't talk. I will leave Kartika to talk about that. But as a practitioner of poetry, I think I'd say this, that around 12 years ago, if I had reflected on what poetry means, the poetry scene, and I talk as an Anglophone poet, right, I would have said it's a dismal scene, publishers are few and far between, royalty checks are few and far between, readers, buyers are few and far between, that it's a bleak scenario is probably what I would have said. Today, I think my take on it is somewhat different, partly because the scene has changed, also partly because I have. In terms of the scene, I think, for one, you've talked about several of the smaller publishers, smaller right, journals that, you know, many people have turned publisher from journal to publishing right, units. There's a mainstream publisher like HarperCollins publishing poetry, which has a credible poetry agenda. Yeah. There's the whole online forum that's available. So amazing number of people writing, putting poems up on their blogs, sharing poems on Facebook, all of that. There's the Lit Fest, which is a sort of animal that makes some of us uncomfortable, but there's a glut of Lit Fests all over the country. And the good thing about that is somewhere between the Bollywood celebrity and Arnab Goswami, there's room for one poet or two. And poets get heard. The good thing about that is poets do get heard. And there are people who buy those books. So I think on the one hand, there's a lot to be optimistic about. The other part, which has to do with my having changed, is just that I think increasingly that when I look back on my own first book, which happened a long time ago, it happened in 2001, but it was preceded by many long years of wait. And when I look back now, I realize I'm very glad I waited. The manuscript changed in those 5 years. And although I thought it was in a state of readiness a long time before it was published, it was actually very good for the manuscript to have waited as long as it did. And I'm not just talking as someone who today doesn't have a problem getting published. I also actually believe that there is a certain freedom in not being as glamorous and as high profile as the Indian novel in English. A result of that is that you have the freedom to write at your own pace. You're not writing in order to suit a particular kind of market pressure. And that can be very liberating, you know?
And actually, I think I'll leave it with the panelists. Yeah. This one, so like you said, you took your time, you actually had time to revisit the manuscript and then get it published, and there's a certain sense of liberation. But that also brings me to the question of if that is the case, and if you're talking also about profit, because we are talking about getting published, of actually making money out of the books you're publishing. If that is the case, then can a poet today just, and I know this is probably an obvious question in the sense of the answer I'll get, but can a poet only be a poet today then? Can you just sustain yourself, as a poet, if you can take that leisure or that liberation of writing?
An Indian poet in English? Certainly
in English,
not.
Right.
No, absolutely not.
And what I'd like to...
I have not been able to live on poetry alone at all. Actually, you want me to talk on the profitability aspect, or generally?
Just about if you think you can just...
Yeah, I think basically I don't think that poetry is a kind of endangered species like we make it out to be at all, because poetry, as long as there is emotion, there will be poetry. That was I became a Facebook friend of Swati just 2 days before coming over, and that's what I wrote to her also. That it's not that human beings alone have emotions. Even animals have emotions, and they respond to emotions. And the way even animals respond, is like it's like they poetize their emotions in some ways. See, suppose I call out to my pet, it has a different way of approaching me. It's not with strangers. This emotional content is what is picked up as genuineness of man, of bird, or beast. Anyway, and it is from this that, given the ability to express, poetry surges forth. So basically, that's all about poetry. And basically, if you ask me all this poetry, profitability stuff and all those things, there are so many yardsticks that will determine whether your poetry can or cannot be published. But then basically what I feel is that if you write, first the poetry does not come to you asking, okay, will Penguin publish me or something like that. Poetry comes first. Poetry comes as an emotion. It comes like it comes creating alpha waves in the brain. It's very, whatever you do creatively, it promotes peace and calm. That's why the very elemental definition by Wordsworth, it's emotions recollected in tranquility. It's emotion, it's recollection, it's tranquil. Now, all these three factors, can bring about good poetry. Now, poetry is basically that. So I don't think we need to unnecessarily worry about getting published by a major publisher or something like that. Especially today, when these the last we had this pulse on publishing thing, where many factors were brought out on how e-publishing is scaring the publishers. In that context, I can say that even a small thing like Facebook. See, 20 years back when I wrote a poem, I wrote it on a notebook. Then I sent it to the magazine, and it came back, and then that was the end. But today that's not the end. You have a Facebook, and you have a blog spot. You call your friends. When what John Donne did when he wrote poems. You packeted it up and gave it to his few friends. Emily Dickinson did that. And are they not great? Yes, they are great. And another thing is, suppose you send your poems to Prairie Schooner, or you send it to Poetry Chicago. They say, buddy, this is not for us, or you follow what we are writing. In that process, what happens is, your self-discovery as a poet is lost to a great extent. And also, I also feel that this kind of things will shatter you, as a poet. If you are wanting to make yourself a career in poetry, these things can all shatter you. And I know many people who have given up and stopped writing poetry, but because after so many rejections.
Yes.
And in my own case, I almost gave up writing poetry, and then I sent some poems to some contest, and then I got some prizes, and then that gave me, these things happen. It's all. So it may not happen to all.
Okay.
I mean, those things. Any other thing?
And like you said about getting rejected from different journals abroad or getting rejected within India, I just actually wanted to know from you, Kartika, if since HarperCollins, like you said, is one of the publishing houses that has a credible agenda for poetry, just a little bit about this agenda and about the way poetry is doing, the poetry that you're bringing out is doing in the market today.
We publish about 4 volumes of poetry maybe in a year, and this includes poetry originally written in English. It's working, yeah. Poetry translated from Indian languages, anthology. It could be something that is in 3 languages on 1 page, sort of thing. So we do multiple sort of poetry collections. If you ask me if it works as a business model, publishing poetry, no, in the sense that it can't pay for increments every year to every employee. No, it can't make money at that level. But the more you see of what is happening with the grand English novel, for instance, if you look at the 2 ends of it, one is very high advances. That is a big problem because then you never earn them out, and it becomes a big issue with just publishing. Every aspect of it becomes a problem. The other thing is you put in a lot of money into publishing something and then you get high returns of that same book, and then you're strapped at either end. With poetry, as a business model, neither of this will happen. There's a great sense of realism about this. We know what kinds of numbers we can do. The poet understands those numbers, so you work with neither liability. You work with the expectations that are on the same page for both people. You say, okay, we will do 1,500 copies, that's good. We know we can sell this out and we will publish that many. So we would pay an advance that's commensurate with that. We will hope to give royalties later, and we will not get returns because we are publishing to the number that we're confident will sell. And then we can always reprint. So we now, because digital reprinting is easy, we reprint in 200s, 300s, 500s, whatever it is that the market wants. And the good news is that we are reprinting poetry titles. So I certainly don't think there is any death around the corner for poetry. I think things are getting better.
Okay. And so, when you put it like that, when you put the business model for poetry like this in the publishing house, it sounds like it's not the kind of unprofitable that we are calling it. It's actually quite sustainable.
It's not unprofitable. It's not hugely profitable, but it will break even and make a little bit of money.
Which sounds better than a lot of other, books that could, other books would be doing in the market, but they're still getting published. But then that also makes me wonder why there are not other publishing houses, big publishing houses following the same model. Then what is going wrong for?
So I can't speak generally, but I can tell you the doubts that I am asked about by my team when they say, why would you block 4 or 5 of your? You can only publish certain number of books, right, in a year. So you might be able to suppose you're able to publish 100 books. Suppose you can do 15 books in a month at the most. And if you're doing, it's a simple case of making money. So if you have a budget that you have to make and you can only do 10 titles in a month, then if you do one of those 10, which you can only print and sell 1,000 copies of over a year, then are you blocking a space for something that could do 5,000 copies at 500 rupees or whatever?
That's the hope that you're working on.
So it's a matter of saying, well, we can adjust this and say, that's okay, we'll make 10,000 copies, sell of something else to make the budget, but it's still important to reserve this one slot for that particular title.
It's about not letting go of publishing that,
it's about that
section. So so you are doing an independent publishing of poetry, and in fact I remember when I was talking to you a while back, you were talking about how Poetry Wala Literature Festival actually ended up selling a lot of poetry. You sold a number of books and it did very well. So could you talk a little bit about publishing poetry from the viewpoint of an independent publishing house that is only doing poetry, which is also a big thing? So.
Right. We publish only poetry, and it's like a passion publishing. And the kind of pleasure actually we get as a team, I think that money will not be like, we can't compare that with the money. Secondly, actually, whatever books we have come out with are of good quality, and they sell very, very well. It's not only one kind of poetry. Like different kind of poetry is written now. And actually, when I look back, say like before 90s, the clearinghouse poets, and I was only aware of only 3-4 poets who were writing in English. Let us talk about only English. That time actually, Adil Jasawala mentioned that the poetry scene and the publishing scene is very bad in English. And in 2003, actually, I started Poetry Wala. And now we have published around 50 books of poetry. And all the books, or maybe some books, are doing very, very well. I mean, we've got profit. I mean, I can actually say that Poetry Wala is a profit-making poetry publishing house. We never entered actually publishing poetry to gain profits. But we are really making a lot of profits, and now we have started publishing around 10 books of poetry. Because now we have got ample, I mean, a lot of money also, and we have buyers all over India and abroad who actually order copies, or trying to make all the books now in e-form, so that people to whom we can't send by post or something, they also can get it. Because they thought, I mean, now the books actually we publish, they feel that this is something different than that of, say, European poetry, or like the concept of post-globalization poetry. Here in India, the way we write is not the way they write there. So they want to know more about the poetry. Like French poets told me, like, your poetry is so nice. I mean, we want to read more of that kind of poetry. I think people want to know more, and they want to know how differently you are trying to write, which are the, I mean, which like interest them.
So actually, if you talk about the fact that your publishing house is actually doing pretty well when it comes to poetry, it's not something that you are noticing as something that's unprofitable or grossly, underutilized. And so are you. You're not saying that it's a majorly so there's still this air that we have about how poetry is dying, and there are articles after articles that keep coming out about how no one's reading poetry, or no one's consuming poetry, or no one's writing poetry, which is something I actually, in fact, was talking to another poet in Delhi, Sukrita, who was talking about how, in fact, there's a glut of poets. There are people who are writing and producing poetry online, offline, all the time. And the real problem is probably bad poetry, or pub poetry that is not literary, which is also a very difficult term to use. If you talk about good poetry and bad poetry, and you talk about poetry that is worth publishing or not worth publishing, how do you make that distinction?
It's actually quite easy for a publisher, because we don't have to deal with anything except our own taste, and we know that we can only do a certain number of books a year. So we are in the happy position of picking what we love and publishing what we think is good.
But are you getting a lot of poetry?
Oh yeah, we get a lot of poetry.
So you get a lot of
we turn it all down systematically.
Because if you're taking out only 4 and for a year,
I've probably found maybe one manuscript in all these years which I found had come unsolicited.
Right.
All the rest of it has come through having read it somewhere else, read a poem, or been following the poet's work,
so it's not the manuscript that you're discovering new poets.
No, it's usually poets that we already admire the work of, and when they have a new collection, we tend to go after them. But we always try and make a point of publishing at least one first collection if we can, every 2 years at least. So there's a poet like Kartika Nair, who was first published by us. Kim Firm's first single collection was published by us. So there are poets that we try and do the first collection of, but even there we are already familiar with their work published here and there.
Okay, and so Mr. Devante, you said that there is you have published a lot of new poets. So how what language are you? Because you yourself write in Marathi also, and you're also translating it in English, and you're working with the 2 languages. So when you're getting new poets, how are you getting your new poets and your new material?
We also get a lot of manuscripts actually. Every day we keep getting manuscripts, but we, I myself spent 30 years in editing and reading and all, and we have got a team which are actually very well-known critics and poets themselves, who actually go through the submitted manuscript. Actually, it is very easy for an editor of poetry to judge a manuscript. Even if I read one poem, I come to know that whether this is good poetry or bad poetry. So we we don't have to spend a lot of time, doing that. Actually, I wanted to actually first tell you, I want to discuss the point like where the whole of press is talking about death of poetry, and they spend a lot of the space, discussing this. They eat everybody's time. I think they are being negative. The whole superficiality actually is at work, and there are a lot of grade 4 authors which are like pushed by the publishers and also by the media, and they come to the forefront. They are not literary at all, and I think the media should not, if they want to publish something, they should publish good thing about poetry, because poetry, the kind of poetry now written in English also, I can tell you about Marathi also, but everybody will understand in English. There are poets who are more better poets than there are poets writing today or known to us. They like poet Aditi Macha, though there are a lot of poets who are writing very good poetry, different kind of poetry in English. So I think actually the future of English poetry is going to be very good than that of the writing like Chetan Bhagat's class 4 writing.
Actually, if we've talked about publishing poetry and we're realizing that it's not as unprofitable as me as a media would make it out to be, and it's also not a dearth of poets today, then is it a problem with readers also? Have we made poetry too rarefied, too esoteric, too removed from the general consumption of the masses? Maybe we've made it look like something that is not easily consumed, and maybe that is what is reducing the readership. Would you agree?
No, actually, what I see, recently I had an occasion to judge some poems of some students in the Technopark. What I came to see was that more than 100 poems were submitted, and the task of finding good poems was not hard. You don't expect techies to. At least I did not expect that they would come into writing of English poetry, and it was really splendid, some of the poems, and we could give only 3 prizes, but I said we should give 1 or 2 consolations also, because that's the way you can promote these things. And the way they look at images, and the way they look at how they can flex or twist language, so we have come. We were talking about good and bad poetry earlier, maybe 20 years back. You could find a lot of such poetry, and even now in many parts of the country, English poetry coming in, you can find that they are shallow stuff. You can find people don't even know, they don't even write correct English when they write the poems, because most of them are good language poets. They try to make their name in English, and the English is not good, so that itself is a deterrent in the first stage. And then secondly, we find that these poems are about all about love and calf love and all those kinds of things. So they don't, and added to it, one drawback of our people, poets who aspire to write, is that they don't read contemporary poetry, much of contemporary poetry. So these are the factors that provide the handicap. If some of these poets who write are steadfast, they forget about putting their names in print, or write anything, put it on the blog spot, it doesn't look good. No, they should first they should understand that there is craft. So once this craft is developed, they should be ready to go out. But the reverse is happening many times. But in cases like Hemant's case in Poetry Wala, etc., where you find a lot of Marathi poetry, or in Kerala where you see a lot of Malayalam poets, the people keep on writing, and there are a lot of cooperatives, there is a lot of activity, a hive of activity going around the poems, poetry. Like in Technopark, I told you, there's a kind of, people read, the kind of, they came to the stage and they were talking, and the range of the literary range, that they equip themselves with before writing their poems or after writing, before their stories. So all this is important to get good writing.
Could I respond? Yeah. I think this notion about death, which seems to keep coming up every few sentences sometimes when people talk about poetry. I remember reading many years ago, there was this little write-up in the Times of India which said that there was a survey, an American survey, that claimed that poets die sooner than novelists. And it's probably true. I remember seeing that and saying, my God, this is the death knell. There's nothing more vulgar than a middle-aged poet. And exactly, all of us who live above 33 are kind of doomed. But, I think going back to what Gopi just said, it's true. It's amazing how many people, particularly at 16, everyone has written a poem, a love poem usually, in blood sometimes. But what is it about about those who've written poems, every one of us, why is it that so few of us actually go out and buy books of poetry? Why do we not become readers of poetry as well? Why is it that we stash those bloody poems away into some back drawer, and why do we never return to them? I think part of the problem, I know I've been a victim of this, and I think it's been a concern, I think, across generations now, is the way in which poetry is also taught in schools. There is what I call the tyranny of the paraphrase, where you're constantly asked this question, what is the poet trying to say? And it's never that the poet is saying it. She's always trying. And you, of course, with your superior intelligence as a student, can write it in 3 flowing, elegant paragraphs, and then you've got your marks in the exam. The poet, of course, has to come up with this spluttering sort of utterance which he can only chop up into incoherent lines. He's not capable of doing it, but you are. You know what he or she is trying to say. I think this is just, as far as I'm concerned, I remember actually losing so much of my excitement about poems as a reader, simply because of this, and I think the fact that we began to believe that if we could write 2 or 3 clever, reasonably clever sounding paragraphs about a poem, we had understood it. So the idea that the poem resides in its meaning alone, I think that for me is really the beginning of this kind of impoverishment in our responses to poetry, because I really don't think that poetry has grown. It's not the issue is really not about poetry being difficult. I'm not the first to have said this. Randall Jarrell, the poet, says, it's not that people have stopped reading modern poetry because it's difficult. It's because people have stopped reading modern poetry that they find it difficult. And I think we were all encouraged to stop reading simply because of the way it was taught, when in fact we are all fully capable, each one of us, of responding to a poem. And just understanding the meaning or just decoding it or cracking it is sometimes, you could have missed the poem entirely, But we all were capable as children of responding to so many aspects of a poem. The sound, the texture, the flavor, the rhythm. Meaning was one small part of it.
So when you bring up something like school and how schools teach poetry, do you think also the problem lies in the fact that we kind of stop, we've frozen the curriculum, we've frozen what is taught, and we haven't, because at least as far as I'm concerned, when I was studying poetry, the moment you said poetry, the big names came to your head, and you thought about Blake and you thought about Wordsworth, and maybe you went on to study Sylvia Plath, or you stopped somewhere there, and there are very few schools that include modern poetry, and that takes away from also knowing who the poets writing today are. And also it gives you the impression that maybe good poetry or poetry that was worth studying stopped there, and it hasn't grown since then. So whatever people are writing today is something we probably won't be able to understand, or we probably wouldn't be able to approach or find relevant. Do you think that's...
Yeah, certainly, it's true that, we had perhaps an overdose of Wordsworth, but I also personally, I'm grateful for having read my Blake and Wordsworth as well.
Of course, yeah.
So I think perhaps what was also important was to be given the tools to at least be able to
To
see that this is
appreciate.
one small part of the world,
Exactly.
voices of the world, one fraction of that. And that for various historical reasons, it has occupied a disproportionate amount of space in our heads. But just to know that so much else was being written.
Yes.
But I do know this as a 16-year-old, this feeling that, my God, I'm going to remain unheard, I'm going to remain voiceless. This was a very real concern for many of us.
Right.
But I also want to say we were talking about the scene in English, that for me, I was lucky to be part of a writers' group in Bombay, and I think that possibility exists for everyone, and I constantly say this to younger poets, because it was hugely empowering to know that there were many young practitioners of poetry in a city that otherwise made you feel that you were a bit of an oddball,
Right.
that there was reason to travel all the way to South Bombay once a fortnight to just sit and read poems and not just discuss where you were going to be published. Sometimes it alarms me that the kinds of conversations poets sometimes seem to have with each other today when I eavesdrop is which festival have I attended and where have I been published.
Right.
They're not talking about poems and the making of poems.
So
one of the taboos in our poetry circle was discussing where to be published.
Okay.
We would just talk about the actual making of that
Poetry,
poem, you
yes.
know.
And so what do you think about the readership that you're getting in Poetry Wala, and what are you do you think that there's scope to expand that readership by making it probably more accessible, or changing the way poetry is like Arundhati said, taught in schools, or by giving people the tools to appreciate it?
That's like too many questions in one.
You can answer one.
And I mean, actually, when I was in school, the kind of poems I was taught are the poems like I had to unlearn everything for say 10 or 12 years. And then I started writing something of my own. So actually you have to, all these Wordsworth and all the poets till today also, everybody has that kind of poetry. They are taught that kind of poetry, and I think the syllabus, all this needs to be changed. And unless we introduce them to new writing, they will not be, they will not enjoy it. Because I have got two sons, the two kids. My son actually, after 10th, he said, no, I'm not going to read poetry for my entire life, because the poetry is very bad. And actually he reads my poetry and he says, this is where I can connect. Though maybe my poetry is not that great like Wordsworth or whoever, but that's the problem. Secondly, curriculum, then all these are the problems actually. Maybe they will be solved or unsolved, but poets will going to write poetry. Let's speak about how to actually make this market, we will call the market of poetry, readership, or buyer's market. I think now I have recently seen that poets are, with poetry, they are actually making some videos, they are making CDs. I saw a very good poetry movie recently in Vienna, and it was wonderful. If you look at that one poem in a film form, and it was wonderful. I would like to read that book then, or if there is some other thing. I think actually instead of making these books or e-books or printed books, poetry, I think people should now go a little further and make this, if possible, a voice poetry, or maybe video poetry or something. Because people actually, I think they will get more connected if poet or some artists, they come together and read poetry of a poet. Because when you read the book, of course we have been reading the books, but when you read the book, it's different. And when you listen to something, or when you actually see the video, it's really different. I don't know how I'm going to make actually, that is my plan.
Remember, even earlier, prior to video also, we had this poster poetry movement.
Yeah.
So visualizing the poem all that was there.
Sorry.
All that was there. I mean, this is only a development on that. We had poster poetry, then we had photographs along with poems.
Hey, but I think the voice and video.
The voice alone, yes.
Voice and video will make a lot of difference, because I actually got stunned when I saw that movie that way. And actually,
so are you talking about changing the way we are presenting poetry
yes,
also?
Yes, yes.
So not just in the plain text in books, but also changing it and making it more performance-based, maybe, or more visual and audio, stimulus.
Right. Actually, so I will tell you, like in Marathi, we have got Sahitya Sammelan. Every year we have a Sahitya Sammelan somewhere in Maharashtra or in certain areas actually where Maharashtrians stay, and there is another one called Jagatik Sahitya Sammelan. For the Marathi Sahitya Sammelan, you will find that there are more than lakh of people. They come and they listen to poetry. At any time, there are not less than 20,000 poets, 20,000 listeners or audience. Right. So I think people actually enjoy poetry that way.
Actually, what I think would be interesting, if we could just open this up, by your permission, of course, if we could find out because we're talking from perspectives of people who are already invested in poetry, who are reading it, who are writing it, and who are publishing it. So if we could find out why people aren't doing these things, why aren't people reading poetry, and the ones who are not buying it, why are they not buying it, and maybe then move on to solutions and what can be done to address those problems, if you think this would be if it is a problem, if anyone recognizes poetry as something they're not being able to approach or not being able to respond to, would it be possible to, if there are any questions in the audience?
I'd just like to confirm what Hemant was saying. Like, for me personally, I've never really been able to connect with poetry unless I hear the poet read. It's very difficult for me to connect with poetry just reading it on a page if I can't hear the person's voice in my head. So, I mean, I also think it's really important, video or YouTube or whatever you can use to bring poets' voices, reading their own work out. It's easier for me, at least.
And how would something like that affect publishing? Because if you're talking about, performance art, it automatically takes it away from the plain publishing.
No, I think I come to it slightly differently from all of you. I agree that performance is brilliant, and to hear a great voice reading a poem to you, there's nothing quite like it, and Arundhati is particularly good at this, so you have to read to us. I mean, then for us to know what that is about, I think that's true. But to me, the response to poetry is very different. As part of publishing and as a reader as well, I think poetry is where it's something like it's almost like a laboratory for language, where new things are created all the time, where things are innovated, where usage is created for the first time sometimes and then goes out into the world maybe years later, or maybe instantly. But it's a playful world where language is constantly being examined, where language is being pulled apart, reshaped, retied. Now, that's about approaching it not so much as form, as poetry or as performance or as publishing or anything of the sort, but to say, if this is where language is being created, then we have to pay attention to it. And if you're publishing literature, then you cannot publish literature without publishing poetry, because poetry is at the heart of that literature. And whatever you do with it, in whatever form you consume it, sell it, write it, whatever, it's about the centrality of language. And I think once we use that and shift the conversation around from profit or non-profit to why do we need poetry at all? Why do we read it at all? Why should we continue to have it in our lives? I think the reasons are so obvious that we have to forget that conversation altogether and go back to what Mr. Couture is saying, and how else can you connect people with it? Can you do photography exhibitions that use poetry and photographs? Can you do video? All that secondary. Because one, I can see it's about the urge to create in a certain way, and two, it's about the fact that we need poetry. And that's the truth of it.
That was very well put. My question is, I have a daughter who's 21 years old, who's heavily into poetry. Okay. In the past 2 to 3 years, because she also does a lot of feature writing on politics, she came back to me and she said that in this age of war and terrorism, she doesn't want to read poetry any longer because it has started to seem fake to her. It has started to seem as if the poets make unusually elaborate promises in the world which is so realistically harsh on us, and take us to a world which is so unrealistically positive that she has started to feel a large gap as an individual. So would anyone like to comment on that, please?
Actually, real poetry is born when the poet or the one who writes it really suffers and writes that poetry, seeing that the world is full of wars and we are giving a fake comment with our poetry, all those are in the distance. Actually, when you are writing as a poet, you are putting forth your emotions, your impact on the war. I mean, what you have seen. So that should crystallize in you first. I mean, so I think poetry should basically emerge from and to the direct soul. I mean, it should not be what the other man has said, or you should not think that it is it's a fake world, so I'm going to stop write poetry.
So here I'm talking about a girl who's ready to take on into a future, a person who's very optimistic, but is actually feeling that gap as a reader. So as a poet, my question is also more to do with what would you suggest to a reader such as that? As a mother, I'm worried.
We can only ask her to read and visualize things of impact that will make her write really good poetry.
And also, I think maybe to just suggest to her that the choice, it's not necessarily about the choice. The two are not necessarily in oppositional positions, the newspaper and the poem. They perform different functions, and both of which are very significant. So we don't have to choose. Thank God we don't have to choose.
Yes.
Well, I feel benefited by these comments, and out of gratitude, I want to return something. Poetry, of course, is the oldest form of creative expression in the human history. It is an order of language which is very distinct from the order of language to which other genres that we recognize as literature belong. For instance, fiction, including stories, short fiction. And therefore, this was recognized by all orthographers along history. When verse was written, the conventions of writing, even when one was writing with some ink on or some stylus on wood bark or ink on paper before printing, verse was written differently, orthographed differently than other orders of language such as prose. Publishers have recognized that though all books look alike, all books are not alike, and that to the extent print technology permits, printers and publishers have made efforts. Now, poetry has a kind of transcendence which a Yellow Pages book does not have, and therefore, books are necessary to carry some reproduction, impersonal reproduction, or orthographing a poem is necessary because it has a transcendence beyond its own time and own space, and the degree of transcendence is much higher, and that's how Dante and Tukaram appeal to me today, just as Arun Kolatkar and Dilip Chitre or Faiz Ahmad Faiz or W.B. Yeats appeal to me today. It's not just, I'm not mentioning these names just because they are big names. They manage to transcend, just as somebody who's writing next door also manages to transcend. Maybe he is next door or she is next door, therefore that doesn't appeal to me, but 100 years from now or 100,000 kilometers from away from a place, maybe on Mars or Moon, that person might, Blake was seen in his time as a stark mad fellow, but all of us are great fans of William Blake today. See? So when we think of publishing of poetry, we have to think of these things as well, and therefore not to think of poet. Supposing 1 kilogram of book of poems and 1 kilogram of book of something else. I'm not saying others are inferior or superior. I'm saying they're different, and therefore those criteria will have to be brought in. Poetry publishing is, in my opinion, necessary for the future and not just for today. And so a larger time span for considering, like, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned 12 years, but I would add, I mean, permit me, because of my loss of hair, to add another 50. I mean, let's look at half a century of publishing of poetry. And there we will have slightly better perspective than looking at publishing scene of poetry in the last 3 years. Thank you.
So that's far from the depressing picture that has been painted. Which is
you painted it. We didn't.
I was told. I mean, I was going by what was written here, and I had to ask. But it's very nice to actually hear this, because that changes perspective completely, and it's approaching it from a much more hopeful thing. So maybe it's good to ask if poetry is dying, because we get to know how alive it is then. But the problem of readership, actually, I'm thinking about how, while I understand why we need poetry, like you said, that was actually one of the questions that I asked in the article that I had done long time back also, about why do we need to write poetry and read poetry. And if that is the need, then shouldn't it have a wider audience too? Shouldn't it also, if it's necessary for us to actually grow as people and actually understand what's being written and perhaps whatever poetry does when you're reading it, shouldn't it have a bigger audience? Shouldn't we do something to make it more approachable? I just want to know the solution for these.
Poetry is a reaction. Actually, first comes the reaction, then based on the reaction you get the kind of audience you're looking at. And suppose the reaction, you move people with poetry. Gettysburg Address is a poem. That Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" is a great poem. And how does it gather readership? By the sheer intensity of the poetry, the ferocity of the poetry, the hope it gives, the power it invokes. I mean, once you bring such poems, you will have readership. That's natural. You cannot force your readership of poetry to anybody. Nobody will read. You understand. But if for example, in Malayalam, there is one epoch-making poem called Naranath Brandan. This man, one Madhusudan Nair, that poet, out of the unknown, he just came and he used the singing part of it, and then that is a shocker. Even today, if the people go and fall at his feet, just one poem. That is how you should create poems. And if you are able to create that, it will last. You don't need today's readership or tomorrow's readership. It will go on, I think.
And also, I think to talk about it not just as something that you must have because it's good for you, but because it's pleasurable.
Because it's beautiful.
It's pleasurable. It's tremendously pleasurable. And I don't think one doesn't need to teach that to someone. You just need to remind them. Because all of us, I think, as children, responded effortlessly to poems when a large part of them were unintelligible to us. We didn't understand what was going on necessarily. There were flashes of meaning, but that patterning of meaning and eclipse was part of the excitement. So I think, I'm also going back to what Rakesh said about listening to it. I think that was also part of the pleasure. One grew up hearing those poems a lot before one even discovered them on the page. That's part of the excitement of it. And at the same time, I think sometimes we talk about performance poetry as if it's important for poets to start, banging on drums a bit and get flamboyant in order to be heard, which is fine. There's some fabulous poets who do that. But I think it's also important for every writer, just like there are many kinds of readers and listeners, there are many kinds of writers. So I think it's important to also find a way of writing a poem that is true to you, reading it in a way that is true to you, And inevitably there is a listener. I think there is.
So actually, I'll just once again ask if there are any more questions. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm addressing this question to Kartika because she is a mainstream publisher. The West has a novelist like Michael Ondaatje, who's known as a poet novelist. And if you read his novels are actually poems written as novels. For example, The English Patient or say Anil's Ghost. It's a way, I see that as a way to transcend poetry and present it in a different form. So he's experimented with that, and he has disciples like, say, Nadeem Aslam, who's himself a very acclaimed novelist. Do you as a publisher get manuscripts like that in India? And if you do, how do you approach those manuscripts?
If I did, you would have known about it. They would be published. So no, I'm afraid I haven't got any of those. I can think of someone like Jeet Tayal, who is naturally clearly a poet who moved to writing fiction and did a novel, which is as much poetry as prose. But no, I haven't got too many of those.
I see. So do you maybe think that the poets that are published by you, do you feel or have you ever suggested by reading that poetry that they should also write more?
I would not make that mistake, no. If they wish to write, yes. And actually Arundhati does write other forms. Someone like Keki Daruwala is a novelist and a poet and good with both forms. A lot of people who write poetry seem to also write in other forms. Either they've come to poetry later or parallelly doing both things. And I think they exist in two different spaces, even in their heads and the way they write. And it's perfectly fine to keep them separate, is my feeling.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I don't have a question. I just want to clarify from the bookstore side. We run the bookstores. I've seen a decline in, it's a realistic picture I'm giving you. I've seen a decline from the last 10 years in poetry. With the decline, I'm sure the readers are not readers. There are readers, I mean to say, but the problem is not many publishers are publishing the poetry. So with the result, the section of poetry is tremendously reduced to certain perhaps 1 inch, So earlier we used to have a lot of books in a section, and there were a lot of a huge section. People used to come, browse, select the book, and it was flourishing in terms of sales. So now the books, like poetry, we might have like 50, 100 books in a whole huge bookstore, and it's lying in some dead corner. So selection is not there. So, but there is a demand. The people are coming for poetry, So, but we have no choice. We have no books to sell. So that's one suggestion I want to give. The other was, we as publishers, we always have marketing strategies for various commercial fiction. We don't have strategy for poetry. So I have never seen a poet coming to a bookstore and reciting some poems and doing a book launch. I've not seen that very often, but not very often. I haven't done anything in our store. And nobody is approached either, So there should be some marketing strategies.
But certainly it could be marketed better, absolutely.
Yeah, right. like the way we do, I'm talking to myself as well. Yes. Like the way we do marketing for commercial fiction, we haven't done for poetry. So what's the way out?
But I'm also, one of the things that does strike me though is when I go into bookstores and I approach those poetry shelves, which are anyway meager, there's such a lack of stuff. Then it's not necessarily because it isn't being published. I must say, and at this point it's important to point out those who in the audience who are in fact publishing poetry. Apart from Kartika, with her very major, who's a major publisher, there's Hemant doing Poetry Wala, there's Sarabjit and his team who have Copper Coin.
But handful,
so what is it about? Is distribution an issue? I think that's a major thing to address. I don't seem to find them in bookstores.
Talking, because actually this is another thing that was pointed out to me, I think by everyone I talked to, in fact, not just the panelists here today, that bookstores are actually reluctant to stock poetry.
Not really, actually.
Is it something that...
Actually, there are two levels, actually. One is, in Indian poetry in English today, we don't have any magazines publishing poetry, actually, basically. It's a big drawback. I think Observer was publishing a long time back. The newspaper was... Do they publish now? No. I think some time back... I also had. I did it myself, but those things we do, but they're all dropping. They get dropped. You have to redo and redo and redo, reschedule and reschedule. That's the problem. There are 2 or 3 levels of problems there. But here we find that mainstream magazines or newspapers. Now, in fact, I was talking to that lady, Kartika, and I think sometimes. Kritika. Yeah, and nowadays they publish some poems. Hindu. It's a great thing, that they are publishing. But there also I find that they are not discovering poetry or something. They are publishing already known poets. What's the point in giving Adur Gopalakrishnan some award? There's no point. He has already won the Dada Saheb Phalke award, and his recognition at the highest level. Now, what we should do is to discover. That's what the magazines should do. And I think there's one magazine, Kavya Bharati. In 1 year it comes once, and you send some 10 poems. All the 10 poems appear, or all the 10 poems don't appear. But there's no selection. If you better editing and better. There is no such school here. In India, for Indian English poetry, there is no school of editing, there is no school of discovering. I don't think even in major publishing houses, this is a bare fact. You have real dedicated poetry editors who look at poetry for the sake of poetry. I don't think these things are there. But that's another side of the story. But one more thing is, if you look at the Western, this thing, there was one name I forgot, one David somebody. Every year he collects the best poems, best American poems every year, and a major publishing house publishes it, and he collects it from many of the I think Jaswinder Bolna was
Harper
also
US does that. Yeah, the best writings or best poems.
There are dedicated souls for that. In Indian writing and English poetry especially, you will find no dedicated, especially self-dedication is the only thing that's happening for the self.
So one point why bookstores are reluctant to keep poetry, because there's no constant supply. Like you said, you do 4 books a year versus 100 books of other sorts of items, So that's. But they're readers.
I think it's a catch-22. I know that a lot of stores are reluctant to keep poetry. They're not interested at all. So we have to go, and even in Delhi, where we're right there, where it's not even an issue of getting copies there. I'd walk into major stores and see Tagore and maybe 5 others, and there'd be that one odd copy of a recent publishing. And I'd say, why is more poetry not here? And they said, oh, do you really? Are there any books? It's a willful blindness.
It's
because they see it as no, it's not about distribution. It's about the willingness of the retailer to make any effort to participate in the selling of poetry. They have absolutely no interest in it. You may be an exception, but they are not interested. And I think it's high time, if they actually feel strongly about this, they have to do something, but I'm afraid they don't care about it. They would rather sell the commercial fiction.
Yeah.
So.
Develop that kind of interest, through magazines, etc. How do publishers even know, or booksellers know, that this name exists?
How booksellers know is easy, because publishers are constantly telling them what the books are. So they get every bit of information from us, because that's all publishers are interested in, moving books out of their warehouse into bookstores so people can buy them. And now there's all these online retailers, so it's not a question of not being able to communicate that. The difficulty of discovering new poets is very much there, because where do you go to find them, and where do you read them? Online is fine, recommendations, blogs, that's the only places we usually find them. It's easier for English language publishers to find good poetry in the languages, because the effort has already been made by somebody, they've already published, and we get word of mouth stuff saying, oh, this poet is really brilliant, then it's an easy job to get that.
Yeah, I have a question to Kartika mainly. It's more about verse than about poetry or prose. See, I happen to write stories for children in verse. I have a collection of stories. And whenever I've approached publishers, see, if you go through it and you say, this is terrible, or it's not good enough, or it's not what we are looking at, that you can understand. But if a publisher tells you, this is poetry, we don't do poetry, or poetry doesn't sell, thank you very much, that is discouraging, because...
You know who our most successful children's writer is at HarperCollins? It's Dr. Seuss. He writes in verse. And we sell large quantities. So we would never say verse doesn't sell. I suspect, and I don't know your writing, so forgive me for this, but there are ways in which publishers say no, and sometimes it's a way of saying, I don't like your work, is to say, it's worse.
That I can understand perfectly. That's perfectly, nobody, you cannot claim the right, you cannot say you have to like my work. Or just because I think it's good, you don't have to think it's good. And the publisher knows better. This much I agree. But I have found very often it's like poetry. We don't do poetry. Poetry doesn't sell. And the second question is related to the first. Is there a space for writings in verse which are neither poetry, as we understand it, or prose? Stories which happen, they are actual stories for children which happen to rhyme. So what we are doing is, we are not inventing something. It was a perfectly legitimate way of storytelling. And I have tried to come out with something like this. If it's not good enough or not publishable, that is fine.
I really don't think there's any sort of hostility to storytelling in verse, especially for children, because so much of it is in verse. But it is true that I have personally seen a lot of manuscript submissions that are fairly ordinary, because if you don't do something really special with that verse, then you might as well tell the story in prose. So it's not, I don't think it could be entirely about the form. It is difficult to publish. Poetry is one thing, but for children, there's usually an affinity towards publishing verse stories.
Hello. I wanted to ask you something, all of you actually. You said that there are no readers of poetry. Could, as in you said, there are no, there's no, yeah, pardon? Yeah, less readers. I write poetry, but I don't read other people's. Yes, because, why? The reason is that I feel that somewhere if I read other people's poetry, I might limit myself to that thing. My creativity will get a little bit, So maybe that could be the reason, because we have, in my opinion, there are many writers of poetry, but not many readers. So is that true? Do you feel that could be the reason?
I think that could be a reason. Okay. But I would just say this. I mean, I certainly do feel the need periodically not to read other writers. You want a spell of not reading other poems just because you need to try and tune into your own voice a little more. I fully understand that. Yeah. And yet, this is not true for, you wouldn't do the same, I'm imagining, for fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe it's also important to know that while you want to tune into what you think is just your voice, and it's very important to retain that, your voice also exists in a context. So don't you therefore want to know, it's amazing how many people also believe that they have written a poem that everyone should read, everyone in the world should read, right? But it's a preposterous kind of assumption to make when you haven't read what everyone else in the world has read, has written either. So maybe what you thought was path-breaking has in fact been said. So this is also the kind of humbling realization that we have to constantly live with, right? So I'm not at all saying it's not a valid reason. It is a reason, but we need to find a way of listening to other voices as well as listening to our own. Yeah. And that maybe we don't always have to shut the other out in a certain way. There are ways of allowing them in more subtle, muted ways.
How do you do that?
Not very successfully. A lot of the time I do feel the need to retreat and do some of those old-fashioned things, But I think, this is what I believe. I think in order to write a poem, first of all, you need to be a very, very fine-tuned listener. And to be a fine-tuned listener, you have to be listening all the time to what is being written, or, the other poems being written in the world, in your own culture, but elsewhere in the world. And also you're listening to people in a particular way. You're taking in what people say, what they're not saying in certain ways. So in order to fine-tune that apparatus, the two go together. The listening and the uttering are not separate.
Okay.
So it's an ongoing process. There's no answer to this.
Okay.
But tell me, do you listen to music? Do you listen to Gulzar's Bollywood music and read his poetry? No. Not even that.
No. I listen to music, but it's not like, consciously done. So that doesn't affect my writing, my style of poems. I mean, writing poetry. But what happens is, see, if I read a book, I'll have that hangover, book hangover. And then I won't be able to write anything for a while. So I have that's one of the observations that I have made, and because of which I restrain myself from reading other people's poetry. And I know few people who do the same, because they don't want to, they want to write in their own way, in their own style, and they don't want others' poems influencing their way of narrating. So maybe that could be a major reason. That's what I wanted to just say.
I can, yeah.
Excuse me. I will just make a small note on that. See, it could work in another dimension also. Like when you read good verse, you will be inspired to write. You must not cut yourself saying that, what you fear, you should learn to overstep. You fear that if I read that, then that hangover will push me back to myself. I will not be able to write. No, that's not true. Many a time, in my own case, I have written poems after reading some poem in which I have seen the kind of spark which I would not have otherwise known, perhaps. There are so many sparks in so many different poems. They are like illuminations. Now, if you learn to get that, then that might work inside you. You get the point?
Yes, but doesn't that affect your originality?
No. How can it affect your originality?
But somewhere, if you read about a certain thing, like certain issue, if you read it in the news, maybe you can write a poem about it.
You'll have to stop living. If you see people around you, you might want to just quit living.
No. What I mean to say is, you observe things, you read the news, you see the news, and then you write a poem. It's your way of expressing. It's your style. It's your, you have that individual factor in that. Ki, okay, fine, this is my voice, Baba, I'm writing it like this. But if you read a poem, and then if you try to write another poem, then...
Sorry, what is your name?
Bhakti.
Yeah, actually, if what we can do is, if you could come back, and because this is something that you should talk to all of them about. So maybe accost them outside the thing. But also, I think we should wrap it up now. Just one thing, if we can take.
He's been waiting.
So is it just a small question? Is it also a reason for poems not gaining so much popularity is because the school texts after, say, elementary school stop poems and just pump you with text?
No, that's not true, actually.
Poetry goes on.
I mean, I've studied poetry till class 12, actually. So it's very much, and you can take it after school too. I don't think it stops. I think it's just the way it's taught that's a problem. I'm so sorry to wrap that up, but I think it's time now. So yes. We should.
That's why I'm standing here.
Yeah. I've got. Okay. So thank you. And any other questions, you can, of course, let them have lunch and then. Thanks. Thank you.